Afternoon. Welcome to this week's Virginia Cyber Range weekly workshop. Today we're going to talk about network fundamentals, right? So last week we started first lesson on network fundamentals, sort of an introductory set of concepts related to networking. And so if you're listening to this recording later on and you haven't listened to that one, I'd take a look at that one first. That kind of sets the stage, and it's a new lesson that we put together for the Cyber Basics course in the Virginia Cyber Range courseware repository. So that lesson will get posted this week. Apologize for the delay. I had to make some tweaks, and I was traveling last week and just didn't get to it until yesterday. So those will go up this week. And this set of slides, it's based on what was originally the first networking lesson in the Cyber Basics course, but I've freshened it up some, added some material. So this is an updated set of slides, and these will go up to in the next few days. So really, what I'm trying to do is take some of these lessons that were created before the Virginia Department of Education Cybersecurity Fundamentals course was created. So it was created without knowledge of the competency list for the 6302 course. Now what I'm trying to do is go back and make sure that these are covering some of those introductory concepts, some of those competencies listed in the course. And so that hopefully will help educators cover the appropriate material. So we're going to start, let's see, okay, so Cyber Ed Topics every Tuesday at 1, recorded, so most folks, we get a handful of folks watching these live, but most folks watch the recordings later on, and if there's a specific topic, please let us know and we'll add it to the queue. We've got a ton of stuff that we can talk about, but always happy to put in a special topic if somebody wants it. So we'll start out with some recent news, technology news and otherwise. First story there, Stan Lee passed away yesterday, or maybe the day before. It was in the news yesterday, so that's not really technology news, but you know, sort of news for geeks, right? But you know, Stan Lee created all the Marvel characters over the last, you know, however long, 40 years, and sort of a legend in the comic book scene, and now with superheroes and movies, and so sad to see that he passed away recently. Second story here. This I just thought would be interesting to share with students. I shared it with my 16-year-old yesterday. This is a news story. For the first time, researchers say Facebook can cause depression. All right, so there's been, you know, in recent months and years, there's been stories about how social media can sort of, you know, make people feel worse about themselves because everybody posts all the great things that happen to them on social media, but people don't post the mundane things they do throughout the day. And so then you go look at other people's social media feeds, and it's like everybody's a rock star except for you. So it makes people, some people, sad, I guess. So this is a news story in MarketWatch. A new study conducted by psychologists at the University of Pennsylvania has shown for the first time a causal link between time spent on social media and depression and loneliness. I don't know, that's maybe not a surprise, but I think this, as they say, first time that there's been this causal link, and so this you know, might be another reason to encourage young people to get on social media less and maybe get out and talk to people. I mean, I don't even use Facebook, and it depresses me sometimes. So here's another story, your smartphone's location data. So there's lots of cool technology news going on. I found some other stories while I was eating lunch, but I'm going to save them for later. This one, your smartphone's location data is worth big money to Wall Street. So this is a news story out of the Wall Street Journal, wallstreetjournal.com, their online presence yesterday, and it's about a it's about a company that uses cell phone location data for lots of interesting purposes. And so if I back up a little bit, if you followed the news at all about the alleged Russian and others' involvement in trying to influence the 2016 election through social media and other techniques, you probably would have heard of the company Cambridge Analytica. And so Cambridge Analytica was a company that was a data broker, right? So Cambridge Analytica purchased data from Facebook and others, but Facebook primarily. And so what kind of data? Well, Facebook knows a lot about Facebook users, right? Because they post all kinds of stuff, and they know who their friends are, and they know what they're, by keeping track of what who people associate with, what kinds of news stories they share, what kinds of advertisements they click on. There's all this information that Facebook and other companies, not just Facebook, but Facebook in particular in this case, Facebook can collect about people, and that's the Facebook business model, right? Facebook doesn't make money by letting you share baby pictures with your grandmother, except that in doing so, Facebook now knows that you're related and knows that you have a baby, and et cetera, and then they can use that information, sell it to marketers who will then try to sell you stuff. So that's the whole business model for social networking sites, is information about you and others. And so Cambridge Analytica bought information about hundreds of millions of Facebook users, and used that data to shared that data with others, sold that data to others, who then used it to mount information operations campaigns to influence people's behavior during the election, right? So they would target individuals with news stories or with posts from fake accounts that would try to get those people to go vote in a certain way. So a pretty interesting case study. So Cambridge Analytica, data broker who sells information that they purchase from other companies like Facebook and others. Okay, so now if we sort of shift over and think about, okay, this is this company Thasos, who this news story is about. They don't. Their data brokers not with social media data, but with cell phone data, and in particular cell phone location data. So what they do is they collect location data from, or they purchase location data from cell carriers like Verizon and T-Mobile and AT&T and others, and that location data can be used in some very specific ways. And their primary marketing discussion is about providing information about foot traffic at businesses. So they can do things like measure foot traffic at your, say you're, Target, and you want to have information about foot traffic at your stores across the US. Okay, so cell phone usage data is a great way to do that, because almost everybody who walks into a Target store is going to have a cell phone in their pocket or in their purse, right? Anybody over the age of 15 maybe. And so now you know how many people, and you can do some simple math to say, well, X% of the people are going to have cell phones, so now we just bump up the numbers by this much, and okay, now we know that there are this many people went to Target at these times. And so if you're Target, that might be interesting information. Of course, if you're Target, there are other ways that you can get that same data, I would imagine, just by using cameras in your, pointed at your front door, for example. But if you're Target, you might want to know about foot traffic at Walmart across the street. And Walmart's not going to give you that, but you can purchase that data from Thasos, because it's all part of this location data. They geofence stores, and they can tell you for anybody how many people walked into their store at a certain time. So then as a business, you could do things like you could correlate sales that Target or that your competitor Walmart has going on, and then you can correlate that data with foot traffic and say, well, if we have a sale on whatever toys at this certain time period, or these certain toys, if these certain toys are put on sale, then that's going to increase foot traffic. And so we know that because Walmart did that and it worked, so now we're going to do that. I mean, that's the kind of, that's probably a very simplistic example, but you can imagine that there's all kinds of interesting things that you could potentially do with this kind of data. And so if we quickly take a look at the Thesos Group website, so thesosgroup.com, here they have this pretty slick graphic. Mobile phones broadcast their locations at regular intervals, whether people are shopping in a store, working in a factory, or boarding an airplane. Okay, so where does the location data come from? Well, there's a GPS on the phone, and the phone is also pinging cell towers. And so the GPS will give very accurate location data. The cell tower pinging gives pretty accurate data because you can triangulate. That cell phone is going to talk to multiple cell towers, and so based on the signal strength and the locations of the cell towers, you can triangulate the location of a person with pretty good accuracy. And so using this technology, they can figure out where people go and why. And on one of their pages, they mention I forget what it is. They talk about people having opted in, right? Yeah, I don't recall where it's at, but they talk about people opting into this thing, right, where they're collecting all this data. Of course, you never opted in. You opted in when you signed an agreement with a cell phone carrier to use their service. You basically opted in to them selling your data because they have a data sharing policy, and when you sign the Verizon contract, you're signing a bunch of stuff, including that data sharing policy. Okay, so what might they do with that data? So they talk about customize your stream. So this is them marketing to customers of this huge repository of location data. Customize your streams across core dimensions, location, measure customer visits to any store anywhere, isolate subsidiaries and branches, and filter by store features, yada, yada, yada. This is interesting. Customer characteristics: distinguish the number of first-time customers from regular customers, seasonal workers from full-time, hotel occupants from conference participants, and more. Okay, so how do they know? That they say they anonymize this data set by giving each handset a unique ID, and then they have unique ID paired with a lat long over time. And so how do they know if you're the first time customer to a store? Well, that's fairly straightforward, right? The first time that particular handset ID is seen at that particular location, they can say, okay, this is a first time customer. If that same ID is seen at that store over and over, then they're recurring customers. How do they know if you're an employee or a customer? Well, if that cell phone goes there in the morning at 8 o'clock and then leaves at noon and then comes back at 1 and then leaves at 5, then that's pretty good. They can guess with pretty good accuracy that you're an employee. And if you just come in for 10 minutes, browse around and leave, then you're probably a customer. So that's how they can drill down on those kind of pieces of information. So this is a use case study. They provide on their website a couple of slides of sort of how this data might be used. And so this is from the thesosgroup.com website. Detailed report: competitive impact of lower prices at Whole Foods. So a couple of months ago, Whole Foods was purchased by Amazon, right? Okay, so what did Amazon do? Well, they lowered prices across the board. Well, maybe not across the board, but they lowered a bunch of prices at Whole Foods in order to draw customers. And so this is Thesos collecting data about about what impact that had on competing stores during a 3-week period, the first 3 weeks after the prices were lowered. So here we look at Trader Joe's for example. So Trader Joe's, you could imagine, is a pretty close parallel, to Whole Foods. A lot of the same people who shop at Whole Foods likely shop at Trader Joe's. And you see that during the first week of this Whole Foods price reduction, you had almost a 10% defection rate, they call it. People who, instead of going to Trader Joe's, they went to Whole Foods because the prices are lower. And then that sort of fluctuates over time. But you see across these different companies, these different grocery stores, there's this defection rate, and they can get some pretty accurate data on that kind of thing. Here's another slide from that same case study. Whole Foods stealing competitors' wealthiest customers. So here we see that this company, Thesos, is able to not only know amount of foot traffic, but they can somehow, I mean, they must be correlating other data because they're able to say, well, the typical Walmart customer makes somewhere just shy of $60,000 a year, but the Walmart customers that are defecting to Whole Foods are the ones that make over $70,000 a year. So how does Thesos know which specific customers make what salary? That's a good question, but it is a little bit it's concerning that they're able to make those sorts of associations. But this is the modern world, right? The data is a commodity, and it's sold and bought for various purposes. So this is an interesting discussion to get into with students. I think, I'm not going to make any sort of moral judgment on any of this, but I think discussing it with students is interesting. In what ways can this sort of information be abused? And there's lots of ways, I think. And what ways can it actually be used for good, right? So if you think of if people are users of modern GPS apps like Waze, for example, you probably recognize that if there's a traffic problem ahead on the freeway, Waze will tell you to get off the freeway and it'll route you around it. Or just driving through town, it'll take you on different routes at different times based on traffic and congestion. Okay, how does it do that? Well, it's same, right? It's you have this crowdsourced location data, and if Waze knows that all the cell phones 2 miles up the freeway are moving at 5 miles an hour instead of the usual 70 miles an hour, then it can obviously make the association that there's some sort of a traffic backup, and it can decide to route you around that whatever bad event. So so that's a situation in which somebody dealing in that data is of benefit to me. Here's another example, and again, this is off the Thesos website. Real-time evacuation data for Hurricane Florence. So this is Thesos sharing data with, Department of Homeland Security, I imagine, or some relief agency in the federal government, and they're able to show if people are following evacuation orders, and this is prior to Hurricane Florence earlier this year, and so the darker red indicates a higher evacuation percentage, and so you can see that these coastal cities are evacuating, and so this kind of information I think would be very interesting to emergency, first responders, emergency personnel, because they know where this bad weather event is likely to happen and when, and they can see how the evacuation is going, and they can, if it's not going as planned, then they could potentially take action by sending people to the locations to encourage people to evacuate, paying for news spots, paying for advertisement to encourage people to evacuate, whatever. But again, this is a situation where this kind of data, this is all based on cell phone data, whose cell phones are where. So this is a situation where it certainly could be used for benefit. So again, I think interesting discussion to have with students. Okay, so let's turn the corner here and take a look at some news that is actually relevant to today's networking discussion, right? So today we're going to talk about network protocols. And one of those protocols is a protocol called Ethernet. So Ethernet is the protocol that makes wired networks function. So if you have a computer in your home or in your office at school that has an Ethernet, a Cat5 cable plugged into it, a cable coming out of the back that's providing the network access, that thing is using the Ethernet protocol over that wired network connection. And Ethernet is another one of these protocols that was developed back in the 1970s. So this news story is from the Twitter feed today in InfoSec. So in 1973, Ethernet was first implemented 6 months after Robert Metcalfe wrote a memo describing it. So where does the name Ethernet come from? Well, he named it after the postulated medium ether, which was later disproven, right? So if you recall from your middle school or high school science classes, there was this notion in the Middle Ages that, light and sound had to propagate through some medium, and they didn't know what the medium was, so they postulated this ether that light and sound propagated through, and it was, of course, later disproven. Ether is not a thing, but that was the name chosen to name this protocol. Bob Metcalfe, sort of tongue-in-cheek, named it Ethernet, and it's interesting interesting bit of network history that the Ethernet protocol, you think of Ethernet as wired networks, right? So we use wired networks for years, and then now most people use wireless networks. So they use Wi-Fi in their home and network a lot. So you think of wired networks as having preceded wireless networks, but really Ethernet, this wired protocol developed back in the 1970s, this was actually based on a wireless network protocol called AlohaNet, which was developed at the University of Hawaii in the late 1960s and deployed in 1971. Wireless network protocol using ultra-high frequency radio. And why was it wireless? Well, here we were in Hawaii, and people were communicating from island to island, and at that time it wasn't practical to lay a cable for many miles under the seabed. So what they did was they set up these ground stations using UHF radio signals, and they concocted this wireless network protocol to allow these distant end stations to communicate. And so Ethernet, which is the wired protocol of choice in just about any situation, is actually based on a wireless protocol called AlohaNet that was, again, developed back in the 60s and 70s. So I think it's an interesting bit of trivia. Okay, one more quick news story. This is just a sort of a flashback to something that we saw a couple of weeks ago. Route leaks sends Google Cloud traffic to Russia. So this happened again just the other day. A misconfigured router, that was actually a Chinese telecom router, but located in Russia, and it appears that it was misconfigured by a Nigerian internet service provider. Kind of an odd combination of nationalities, but anyway, the short story is this is another one of these situations where a whole bunch of network traffic went to the wrong place, was routed through a foreign country, supposedly on accident, but could have been purposeful and malicious. This stuff just happens a lot. Okay, so all right, so lots of news stories, and now we're going to turn the corner. I'm going to talk about network fundamentals, and I have a set of slides, and I'm not going to get through all of them, but I'm going to get through quite a bit of it. And if I don't quite get to the end, we will finish next week. Okay, network fundamentals. Again, this is an updated version of the network fundamentals slide deck that is in the Virginia Cyber Range courseware repository under the Cyber Basics course. And so these learning objectives are updated a little bit. We're going to compare networking conceptual models, and specifically we're going to look at layered network models, so OSI and TCP/IP, and layered networking is listed under the Virginia Department of Ed CTE course 6302's Cybersecurity Fundamentals. So we'll hit that a little bit, and then we're going to talk about some networking protocols. Again, this is out of the 6302 curriculum. Understand basic concepts related to networking in Linux and Windows. So we'll see how far we get. May be able to pull up, do some hands-on with Linux and/or Windows, and then apply software tools such as Wireshark to examine network traffic. Okay, so here we go. Layered models. Okay, so so any student of computer networking is going to quickly have to understand that you know, last time we talked about sort of the network topologies, right? We talked about local area networks, you know, a handful of computers connected together in a small, you know, in a single physical location. Wide area networks, much larger geographic locations with multiple local area networks connected together. And then when you connect all these things together, what you get is something like the internet. So that's you know, network topologies, that's interesting from a networking standpoint. But if you're going to really delve into how computer networks function, and if you're going to be a cybersecurity person who really has to understand how these protocols work together, you really have to understand this notion of layered network models. And so what is a layered model? So layered models provide a standard framework for interconnecting network protocols to allow for end-to-end network communication. And so I'm going to talk about protocols used at these different layers, and then I'm going to use a whiteboard on my computer here. We'll see how this works. I'm going to use a whiteboard and sort of sketch out how these protocols work together, hopefully in a way that makes it a little bit more understandable if you're not familiar with this at all. Okay, so layer models provide a standard framework for interconnecting network protocols to allow for end-to-end communication, and they allow for independence and modularity. So the interesting thing is that you can pull out a protocol at a certain layer and put in another protocol, and the protocols in all the other layers can stay the same. So for example, we have two layered frameworks that I'm showing on this slide on the right. So on the right is the OSI model, Open Systems Interconnect, which is a layered network model. And this is more of a sort of a theoretical model that's used a lot in teaching, and it has 7 layers. So physical, data link, network, transport, session, presentation, and application. And in fact, from a practical standpoint, the layered network model that is used in the internet is the TCP/IP model. And if you remember from last time, TCP and IP are network protocols that were developed back in the 1970s by Vint Cerf and others. And so if we look at the TCP/IP model, and so we'll forget about the OSI model for a minute. At the application layer, you might have a protocol like HTTP. And so I'm going to use the HTTP protocol on that my web browser understands. And so I'm going to use my web browser to browse to a web page. And at the application layer, the protocol that's going to be used is HTTP. So I might go to http://www.nasa.gov, for example. So HTTP is the application layer protocol. At the transport layer, the protocol is going to be TCP. And at the internet layer, the network layer, the protocol is IP. And we're going to talk more about these protocols in the coming slides. I just want to take this aside and talk about the modularity piece. IP at the internet, and then at the host/network layer, if it's a wireless network, it's going to be Wi-Fi. Okay, so let's say I'm done browsing the NASA website. Now I want to send an email from my Outlook email client. So now I'm going to be using a different protocol at the application layer. I might be using something like the POP protocol. POP stands for Post Office Protocol. So POP protocol is one of the client-side email protocols. And POP is going to communicate from my email client, Outlook, to the email server, which could be whatever, Exchange. But at the lower levels, POP is still going to use TCP, IP, and Wi-Fi to make that communication, right? So at the lower layers, those protocols stay the same. So these protocols are modular. I can unplug HTTP from the top and I can plug in POP, and this thing is still going to work. This protocol stack is still going to work. And then let's say down at the bottom here, let's say my Wi-Fi connection is bad because the Wi-Fi network is saturated, and so I decide to unplug, or I decided to turn off my wireless interface card, and I'm going to plug into the wired network. And so when I plug in, oh, my pen is doing this weird thing. Apologize for this. Now at the host network layer, I'm going to be using Ethernet. Okay, so now I'm not using Wi-Fi anymore. I basically just unplug Wi-Fi, plug in Ethernet, and still I'm going to be using IP at the network layer, TCP at the transport layer, and the post office protocol at the application layer. So these things are modular. You can unplug and plug in different protocols for different reasons. The ones that generally stay the same, not always, but generally, are TCP and IP. Usually those are the. Now there are alternatives for both of those that are used in some specific situations, but in terms of our regular daily internet usage, TCP and IP are most often used at the network and transport layer. Okay, so these are two-layer network models. The TCP/IP model, this is the one that's generally used in practice, and the OSI model, which is more sort of a theoretical framework used in education settings for the most part. So, so now we have this layered network model, right? So now it's interesting to think about this notion of data encapsulation. So at each layer in the protocol hierarchy, information is encapsulated with header data on the way down. So what happens at the application layer is if I browse to http://www.nasa.gov, what my web browser is going to do is it's going to take that HTTP request and it's going to send it down to the transport layer. And the transport layer is, so this is a GET request. So GET is an HTTP protocol command. And I'm going to get www.nasa.gov. And that's what's now contained in this data unit from the application layer. So what the application layer does is it takes that request and sends it down to the transport layer. And now we get this header, TCP/UDP header. Again, most of the time it's going to be TCP. And the TCP header is going to say, I need to communicate with port 80 because that's the port on which web servers listen for connections. Then, there's a bunch of other information that's going to get put in the TCP header, and we'll look at that here in a minute. And then that message, so now the data is encapsulated in this packet that includes the header, and then we send that down to the network layer. Network layer is going to take that whole thing, and it's going to put it, it's going to attach this IP header to it, Internet Protocol header. And that's going to have source and destination IP address and a bunch of other information. And then that whole thing is sent down to the data link layer. And so this is either Ethernet or Wi-Fi. And you're going to get this frame header with MAC address and some other information. And then there could be a trailer at the end with like a checksum to make sure that the data is not garbled in transit. And then that's the thing that's actually sent out over the wire, and then it's received on the other end. And on the other end, it makes its way back up this protocol stack, and those headers are stripped off, and the data is read by that protocol, and action is taken. So that's the notion of data encapsulation. It happens at each layer as data is handed down through the protocol stack, and then when it comes back up the protocol stack at the receiving end, those headers are going to be stripped off, and the action is going to be taken based on information in those headers. Okay, so let's think about some network protocols. What is a network protocol, first of all? So we'll start with just sort of a definition. So network protocols define rules of communication between network devices. So rules of communication, right? So some apply directly to directly connected devices. So some of them apply between directly connected devices, like my computer is connected to a wireless access point. So those devices are directly connected to each other in the network. And this happens to be a wireless link, but it's a direct connection. And so some protocols apply to directly connected devices like Ethernet and Wi-Fi. So when my computer is connected to Wi-Fi, that's the direct connection to the wireless access point. If my computer is connected via Ethernet, it's going to be connected to a switch in the same room or another room, but it's a wire that goes directly from my computer to that switch, and so that's a direct network connection. And so some apply to those direct connections, some apply to end-to-end communication. So for example, IP is, when my computer creates an IP header, and if I'm trying to get a web page, for example, from www.nasa.gov, then that's a protocol that is applying not to directly connected devices, because my computer is not directly connected either by wireless or wired network to www.nasa.gov. That web server is sitting somewhere, I imagine, in Northern Virginia, and there's many network connections between my laptop and that web server. So that's an end-to-end communication sort of a scenario. And then the same is true with the HTTP, right? My computer has an IP address, NASA.gov has an IP address, so that's the end-to-end IP communication. And for HTTP, my web client, which is a web browser, Chrome or Firefox or whatever, is going to connect to a web server that is sitting on a computer with the IP address for www.nasa.gov. So that's what I mean by directly connected versus end-to-end communications. Protocols also define specific formats for messages exchanged between systems, and we'll take a look at some of these formats here in a minute. And we'll do an exercise, not today, but later, next week or the week after, where we actually look at some of this protocol data using a tool called Wireshark. And when you see that, it makes a lot more sense. And when you get students looking at the header data in actual network traffic, it just makes, I think it makes a lot more sense to them. And so, today it's going to seem sort of theoretical, but later we're going to actually look at some network traffic. And then third bullet here, some protocols support message acknowledgement, data compression, and other mechanisms for efficient and reliable communication. So when these protocols first came out, they were sort of rudimentary, right? But they quickly evolved to include techniques for reliable communication, so that it's certainly possible, especially over a wireless connection, where you might get interference and you're sending bits, right? So a piece of network data is going to be binary data, so it's bits, it's on or off, zeros and ones essentially. And over a wireless connection, it's certainly not unusual for zeros and ones to be corrupted because of interference, and now a zero becomes a one, or a one becomes a zero, or the zeros and ones are unintelligible. And so so the protocols have to be developed in such a way that if that happens, you know that the data has been corrupted, and the protocol can recover from that. And usually the way it recovers, so specifically in the case of TCP, is if your machine receives a message that it's able to recognize as corrupted, then your machine will basically just ask for that packet to be retransmitted, and then the sender will retransmit it, and then you'll get the right data upon retransmission, hopefully. So if you get deep into networking course, you would talk about things like efficient and reliable communications, but for now we're just happy that this stuff all works. And so this is a good, so in my text box here, this is example I like to give to students. So you know, think about a protocol. You know, so we talk about protocol as rules for communication between network devices. So think of a protocol for voice telephone communications, right? If somebody calls you, and I know this might be a little bit less relatable to the teenage set these days because they never talk to each other on the phone. They just, at least my kids don't talk to a lot of people. They just text them and stuff. But certainly they know how a telephone functions, and if their phone is to ring, what do? You push the button, or you know, we used to like pull it off the cradle, and what do? You say hello. So that's sort of a protocol, right? If you don't say hello, if you just pick it up and put it to your ear, then the person on the other end of the line, they may not know that you've answered. And if they do realize that you've answered, you know, they're sort of uncertain, right? They're you know, you didn't say anything, so they're kind of like, are you there? You know, they're gonna try to confirm that you're on the other end of the line. And why is there this period of confusion? Well, it's because you didn't follow the protocol, right? You answer the phone, you say something, you say hello, or you say your name, or you say, you know, whatever. And if you do that, then everything's fine. The communication takes off from there. We chat, and then we say goodbye and hang up. But if we don't follow the protocol, then things are weird. Same with computer networks, right? There are specific protocols that have to be followed. In the case of computer networks, it's much more clearly defined, right? If your computer doesn't respond to an HTTP, if your web server doesn't respond to an HTTP request in a very specific way, then the requester is just not going to do anything. There's no way for the requester to recover from that, except for to resubmit the request, and maybe it'll get an answer the next time. But anyway, the telephone thing I think is a good example, and there are probably other good examples. I don't know, maybe there's some good examples related to like text messages. You know, if somebody sends you a text, if you don't answer it within a certain time period, then they're going to start, you know, making assumptions about whether you are still their friend or whatever. That's maybe not quite as clear. Okay, so now we're going to sort of take a walk up the protocol stack. And if you remember, at the very bottom of the stack is the physical layer. And then you have link layer, network, transport. And this is the TCP/IP model, right? And then at the top you have the application layer. So we'll start here at the bottom, physical layer. This is where the actual bits are transmitted over using some waveform, and that's either wired or wireless. So the media could be twisted pair, you know, these cables that plug into the back of your computer. So that's twisted pair. Might be fiber. So fiber is this stuff. Coaxial cable is used by if you have cable modem, for example, there's probably a coaxial cable that comes out of your wall and plugs into the back of your cable modem. Or it could be radio or IR. So those are different types of media. And then, you know, some interesting discussions to get in with students are things like, you know, what's the most secure? What's the least secure? Why? And you know, you know, we had this discussion last week when we talked about wired and wireless networking, but again, I think it's worth revisiting and just talking about, you know, why is wireless a little bit less secure? Well, because anybody can hear your wireless transmission, and if you're not sending data in an encrypted way, then they can eavesdrop on that communication and then use it to read your credit card number, for example. Troubleshooting step 0, make sure it's plugged in, right? So this is sort of old school network troubleshooting when your network doesn't work. You know, and people have probably seen this in their home network, right? Make sure the network cable is plugged in properly. Make sure your Wi-Fi is you know, authenticated with your wireless access point. Sometimes you know, in your home network, the Wi-Fi won't be working well, and what do? You turn off the wireless access point and turn it on again, and your devices get reassociated. So that's the physical layer. Next layer up, data link layer. Data link layer. This is a point-to-point protocol, right? So this is communication between maybe my laptop. So that's my laptop, and then there's a switch. And this switch in our office at Virginia Cyber Range has a whole bunch of other people's computers connected to it. And then, so the data link layer is used for that point-to-point communication. Same is true, again, if you have a laptop that's connected to a wireless access point. Wow, this is acting weird. You have this wireless communication, that's all data link layer stuff. So Ethernet is wired, Wi-Fi is wireless. Data link layer devices are switches and bridges. So the most widely used data link layer device is a switch. Okay, network layer delivers data between hosts, possibly on different networks. So if you have a computer that is on a certain network, you know, so that computer might be connected to a switch. And gee whiz, apologize for this. And then in some other network, you might have a web server. And again, this might be www.nasa.gov. And this thing is going to be connected to a switch. Between these two systems is generally going to be many routers. So you'll have a switch connected to a router, connected to the internet. And this switch is going to be connected to a router. Routers are going to be connected into the internet. Of course, what's in the internet? Well, you know, in this case, internet is a bunch of other routers that are all sort of connected together in this mesh network. And so each one of these devices is going to have an IP address. NASA.gov might be 174.26.2.1. Completely making that up. We'll look later at how you get that kind of data. My computer might be at 53.27.6.1. And so the network layer delivers data between hosts, possibly on different networks. So here I have my computer in a network at Virginia Tech, and I have www.nasa.gov, which is sitting in a data center somewhere up in Northern Virginia, and between us two are some portion of the internet. And so the network layer is going to make sure that when I browse to that specific URL, www.nasa.gov, that URL is properly associated with a specific IP address, and my computer will request that web page from that IP address, and that data will get properly routed through the internet in order to connect to that IP address on the far end. And then the response will come back using the return address in the IP header to get the data back to my specific computer sitting at Virginia Tech. So it delivers data between hosts, possibly on different networks. Protocol data unit is the packet, and then each system has an IP address. IPv4 is what we're going to talk about here. 32-bit address, usually written as 4 octets in this dotted decimal notation. Here's an example: 172.16.1.250. So here's an IP address, and it's 32 bits, right? So we divide it into octets, 8 bits, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 bits per octet. And so if we look at that address we looked at here, 172.16.1.250, here is that IP address in binary. And if you did the binary conversion, you know, the binary to decimal conversion is something interesting to talk to students about. You can do that on your Windows 10 computer. The calculator app has a programmer's setting so that you can convert between decimal and binary. But as far as the computer is concerned, this is how IP addresses are represented, as 32-bit addresses. So 32 bits. Here's another aside here, and I think this is something useful for students to understand. IP addresses are 32 bits long, okay? So a question that you can ask the students is, if you have a 32-bit IP address and every device in the internet has to have a unique IP address, how is it that how many total devices can we have in the internet? And the answer to that question is 2 to the 32, right? Base 2 numbering system, 32 places, so 2 to the 32, and that equals roughly 4.2 billion devices. Okay, so if every device in the entire internet has to have a unique IP address, then we could have a total of 4.2 billion devices in the internet. Okay, so we just looked at this company Thasos that talks about cell phone data, and it said that there were 5 billion cell phones in use today. So there's a quandary. That's just cell phones, right? Do all those cell phones have IP addresses? I would say that probably most of them do. So just looking at cell phones alone, we go past this 4.2 billion number of possible devices in the internet. And if you think back to 1973, when guys like Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn developed the IP protocol, there were a total of maybe a few dozen systems that were going to be on what was the internet in those days. And so they said, holy cow, 32 bits, 4.2 billion devices. There aren't even that many people in the world. We will never get to 4.2 billion devices on the internet. That's one of those famous last words kind of a thing. Now we're well beyond 4.2 billion devices. So how is it that we get around this limitation? There are a couple of ways, and we'll talk about that more as we go further. But just to foreshadow a little bit, there's this thing called network address translation, or NAT. We talked about this a little bit in the last discussion. Network address translation helps us get around this $4.2 billion device limitation. And another way we get around it is with, remember that we're talking about an IPv4, IP version 4 address. There's this thing called IPv6 that has 128-bit addresses. So now you're talking about 2 to the 128, and that is, they say that the number of IP addresses in the IPv6 address space is more than all the stars in the universe, or more than all the grains of sand on Earth. So lots of room for expansion if we get into using IPv6. And IPv6 is not used universally. It's used more in some places than others, but that's certainly a way to get around this limitation in the IPv4 32-bit address space. Okay. Some more information about the network layer. We're gonna take a look at checking our IP configuration. Probably won't get to it today. We'll get to it next time. But you use, on Windows, you use a command called ipconfig, command line ipconfig, or on Linux, you use ifconfig. Why is it different? Just because it has to be different. No good reason why it's different. It just is. And we'll take a look at those commands next week, and we'll see the information that they give you when you use them. And you get lots of information about things like your own IP address, your default gateway address, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, there's this notion of, there's a protocol called address resolution protocol, and this resolves MAC addresses to an IP address. So if we have systems on the same network, remember MAC addressing at the link layer, that's how individual devices are identified through their MAC address. Medium access control is what MAC stands for. Yeah, but these devices also have an IP address, so if you're communicating with a system, you have to be able to associate the MAC address on a specific device to that device's IP address, and the protocol used to do that is this address resolution protocol. Then you have some other protocols. ICMP is what networks, it's some sort of background network communication that helps control for like congestion and stuff like that. And then there's dynamic host configuration protocol that's used to dynamically assign IP addresses to devices as they enter and leave a network. These are sort of some more advanced topics in the network layer. IP version 4 header. We're not going to delve too deeply into this, but it's useful to just sort of take a look at this and say, there's a, it starts out with a version number, 4 or 6. Those are the only 2 versions that are used in the internet today, versions of the IP protocol. You have the length, a lot of this stuff you can, it sort of makes perfect sense, right? You want to have the total length of the particular data packet that you're sending, because the receiver is going to look at that length in the header, and if the length of the packet that it received doesn't match the length specified in the header, then the receiver knows, hey, something's wrong with this packet, and something got corrupted along the way, and that's one of these techniques used for reliable data transmission. You have identifiers, you have some flags, you have all kinds of various very important IP header fields that we're not going to talk about because you don't really need to know about them unless you're delving deep into computer networks. But really the important part of the header, as far as we're concerned, is the source address and the destination address, right? So the source address is going to be the IP address for my computer if I'm sending the packet, and then the destination address is going to be the IP address of my destination, which the example I've been using today is www.nasa.gov. And then you have some other header fields, and then you have the data itself, right? So if I'm sending a request for a web page to nasa.gov, then the data is going to be something like get, the web page, and it's going to have some other data specifies what exactly I'm asking for from that web server. Next layer down, transport layer delivers data from a process on one host to a process on the other host. So the network layer gets data from one computer to another computer. The transport layer is a little bit more nuanced. It gets data from a process on one host to a process on another host. So an example here is the process on my computer that's being used to grab a web page from nasa.gov is the web browser, and then the process on that web server that's going to respond is the web server software. And this communication is done using port numbers. So a web server is going to be listening on port 80, and my web browser is going to use a source port of some number higher than 1024, so it might be 2048. And so my browser is going to sort of make up a source port number, and it's going to specify the port of the web server, which is always going to be running on port 80 or port 443. And so port 80 is HTTP, port 443 is HTTPS for secure. And then the response is going to have, you're going to flip it, right? You're going to have a destination port when the answer comes back to my computer, destination port of 2048 and a source port of either 80 or 443, depending if I browse to HTTP or HTTPS. Transport layer protocols used are transport control protocol, transmission control protocol. TCP is connection-oriented, reliable delivery. Congestion control has all kinds of bells and whistles to make sure that when I request a web page, I get that complete web page back. And if I don't, and it's sort of all or nothing, either the communication works or it doesn't. UDP is a different protocol, also used at the transport layer, but this is used for unreliable communications. And there are some situations in which unreliable communication is okay. And I'm not going to get into the details of that right now, but these are two different protocols used at the transport layer. But what most of your applications are using is TCP. Here's the TCP header. I mentioned we had the source port and the destination port. Those are really the most important bits of data, except for the application data itself. So this is where that whole IP thing is encapsulated. I'm not going to get, so there's this notion of connection set up in TCP, right? So you do, so when my web browser connects to the web server, what happens is my computer sends a TCP connection request with a couple of specific flags set. The web server, if it receives that request and wants to respond to it, then it's going to, so I send a SYN, the web server is going to respond with a SYN and an ACK, and then the web browser is going to respond with an acknowledgement. So ACK means acknowledgement. So SYN is synchronize, ACK is acknowledgement. So I send a synchronized message, the server sends back a synchronized with an acknowledgement, and then I send back a final acknowledgement. And then once that three-way handshake has happened, now I can request my web page. Now I've set up a virtual connection with the web server. And then at the application layer, I'm going to stop here, but at the application layer, you have protocols like DNS. So this resolves domain names to IP addresses. So for example, before I can send an HTTP request to nasa.gov, my computer has to know the IP address of nasa.gov. So DNS makes that happen. We'll take a look at some of these specific exchanges next week when we finish off this this networking fundamentals discussion. Another application layer protocol is HTTP and HTTPS. That's the web, right? Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Email protocols include things like SMTP, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. This is the protocol that's used between email servers. And then you have protocols like POP, Post Office Protocol, and IMAP. Those are both protocols that are used between email clients like Outlook and the email servers. And then you have protocols like SSH for remote access to other computers, and file transfer protocol to send files back and forth. Okay, and I've gone over time, so I'm going to jump back into this lesson next week, and we'll finish it off. So I appreciate everybody's time today and attention, and for those listening later to the recording, hope this is useful to use in class. And I look forward to finishing this discussion next week. This new version of these slides will be posted hopefully before I get into this discussion next week, so you can sort of use the slides and take notes on them and refer to them during our discussion. All right, so thanks, and we'll see you next week.